Hi everybody, a very warm welcome to Life, Loss and Hope again, and a massive thank you to all of you who have messaged, phoned me and given great encouragement, and to all of you who have liked and subscribed. I mentioned in the introduction how profoundly my mother's death impacted me at an early age, and so here we are in March, and March for me is the month of many reflections. Especially with Mother's Day marketing over the last few weeks popping up here, there and everywhere, how could we forget? It is a really challenging time for many. Mary, my beautiful mum, was born on the 1st of March. She died on the 8th of March, which is today. And then there's Mother's Day later on in March. And like you probably, I've been getting emails about opting out of Mother's Day for some weeks. Marketing companies are aware that it can be a very sensitive issue and thus give us the option of opting out of seeing the Mother's Day gifts and the flowers. This initially seemed to me like a sensible idea, just to click on the link to opt out, to avoid feeling the loss all over again, to avoid being sad, crying, or being not myself, or even feeling ungrateful for being a mum, or weak that I still miss her so much after all these years. However, as I hovered over that link, I felt a strong no rising up inside me. What struck me was that I didn't want to opt out of the memories and remembering her this Mother's Day. By opting in, there was an opportunity in my busy life to intentionally engage in the grief of missing her and even embrace some painful emotions. Grief is love remembered and expressed, and to grieve is a verb which in itself implies action, a forward motion. We must tend our grief. Mother's Day can be tough and painful for many, many different reasons. The death of a mother, the loss of not being a mother, having a difficult relationship with a mother, being rejected or estranged from a mother, and then there are those who haven't been able to be with their own mothers during COVID times, and mothers who have lost children. So many significant losses can surface at this time of year and are all important and valid to acknowledge. We miss people because we love them. And I would never want to forget my mum and the bond that we shared. Like those opt-out emails, our friends and family and even society can well-meaningly want to protect us and brush grief under a carpet. Everyone has a different experience, and often in early grief it may be helpful to not talk or be able to acknowledge the enormity or reality of what has happened, as it can be too overwhelming. However, over time, and in our own time, more importantly, being able to acknowledge and talk about our feelings can bring gradual healing. I'm sure people have said, time heals, but time in itself doesn't heal. What time does as it passes is it offers a space. As it passes, it creates more space, a space to get a different vantage point and perspective on how we see things and feel. It seems counterintuitive to purposely give ourselves an opportunity to enter into memories, to listen to music, to talk about the person who has died, or to even look at photos. But having a specific time to remember service at the hospice in a small group used to be very emotional but helpful as an acknowledgement of the life and death of a loved one. Sometimes people feel that they are negatively wallowing in sadness or even going backwards, which is an unhelpful thing, like a holding on to the past. However, the truth is often the opposite, for as you allow these emotions to surface and have a cry, you are attending your loss and bringing another layer of healing. I talked about sharing stories And if you would like to share your story or a photo of your mum, please do. And this is my story. When I was about 18 years old, a long time ago now, somebody asked me a question. What would be the worst thing that could happen to you in life? It was an innocent question, and my immediate answer was, losing my mum or dad, or not being able to have children. I would have ordinarily forgotten that question if it were not so long afterwards that my father was diagnosed with cancer. He had surgery, then treatment, and we feared that he may die as he got so sick with the chemo and the radiotherapy. I used to hear my mum cry in their bedroom at night while I silently cried too into my pillow, realizing that life had become fragile. As a teenager, what seemed so incredulous and destabilizing to understand was that my father was only in his late 30s. He was very active, athletic, was a footballer, a cricketer. He worked outdoors, he loved hill walking, and he had never drunk or smoked. So why him was the question. But why not? I realise now that nothing makes sense with death, cancer or illness. It can be arbitrary and strike regardless of age, our choices or our lifestyle. Hopefully we can maximise our chances of living a long, healthy life by making positive life choices, but there are no definite guarantees. I suppose what we all believe is that our parents are invincible and will be around forever. The security of their presence is only fully realised in their absence, and the threat of their absence has a deafening, scary sound. Remarkably and thankfully, my father recovered well, which was a big relief for us all. However, only a few years later, my mother was diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumour for which they could only offer her palliative care. The radio was to prevent the intracranial pressure rising, and it did give her a longer life. As if it were yesterday, I remember her calling me to say that she felt something was wrong with her speech. I was working as a speech therapist at the time, so it seemed ironic, and I had a very trained ear, but I hadn't discerned any problem. I thought it was perhaps related to a recent dental issue that she'd had. But within days she had other symptoms of numbness in her arm and her face, and she went to the GP, who diagnosed a Bell's palsy and told her to rest up for 6 weeks. You know, somehow intuitively that didn't really feel right to any of us. And even from my own neurology training, I learned that the facial nerve had no shoulder or arm involvement. So we all encouraged her to go for a second opinion, and she did. That was on a Monday, and by the Thursday she had had a CAT scan which showed a big, deep-seated, inoperable brain tumour. And our world fell apart. I was pregnant at the time with my first baby, and in the goodness of God's timing, I had just started maternity leave, and that enabled me to work in her shop during the day, a wool shop, and then help with my father with her care in the evenings. We chose, maybe naively, to look after her at home, and during the daytime she would sit in a big armchair in the hub of the house, in the lounge. She was always fully dressed with a bit of makeup and a bit of perfume, and we gave her the dignity and respect of being still part of the family. The radiotherapy did enable her to be with us at Christmas, to see my eldest daughter after she was born in the January. And I'll never forget my father virtually carrying Mum into the hospital to see me as a new mother and her new granddaughter. She couldn't hold her in the way she wanted because of her hemiplegic arm, so we carefully placed the new baby on her lap for a cuddle. I felt like my heart would break with the joy of becoming a new mum, and then the realisation of not having long left with my own mother. The weeks that followed were increasingly tough as Mum started to decline rapidly, having epileptic fits, was unable to communicate. And so we moved back in with them. And it was the finest hour to be able to take care of her at the end of her life, as she had taken care of me when I was a child. And in those moments of trauma and vulnerability, a beautiful intimacy forged between us that I'll treasure all my life. On that last evening before she died, I remember my father saying, "It will be tonight." I wondered how he knew, and I was very scared. I had no idea what to expect and how I would cope. My daughter of 8 weeks was with us as my father and I were holding her hands and encouraging her to let go of this life. And even though her eyes were closed, she was aware of our presence and our words. Hearing, as I've learnt through my work at the hospice, is often the last sense and is intact at the end of life. And occasionally a tear would roll out of her eyes all the way down her cheek as we talked to her to reassure her that we would be okay. She didn't want to leave us. She was only 47. Finally, just as I'd finished breastfeeding my baby, she stopped breathing after many hours of that rasping and intermittent breathing. It was a holy moment. I saw what looked like a white ribbon coiling upwards and then disappearing. I heard a peaceful silence in the beauty of eternal life being birthed. It was my first encounter with death and heaven. So this Mother's Day, I'm opting in to remember my precious mum. I'm going to buy her favourite flowers, freesias, she loved freesias, and some dark chocolate. It's got to be Bourneville. And I may give a few gifts or donations in her memory, as she loved to give. It was part of who she was. You could never leave her house without something from her garden, some parsley, her latest baking, or some wool from her shop. And I'm going to talk about her with my sister, my children, my grandchildren, and keep her alive and fully present, even if it hurts. For me, God has been ever present and even closer in those worst of times. For his promise is never to leave us and to be close to us when we're brokenhearted. The worst of times have been the best of times because he has been so close as my breath. When working at the hospice, it always deeply moved me when at the end of life, a very elderly man or lady would cry out for their mum, for a mum's touch. There's nothing like a mum, and we always need our mum, no matter how old we are. As a quote from Keelan Gilbrand says, "The love that crowns us also crucifies us." And as the song says, "If I never loved, I never would have cried." So my prayer for all of you who are missing a mum like me today, that you are strengthened and comforted, that your mother's heart is quietened today. I pray that you will feel loved and that you are not alone. From my heart to yours, sending love on this Mother's Day.